Hey girls and gals, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor and today's video is another installation in my constantly reading series. So today I am going to be starting the Bachman books by Stephen King. Now at this point in my Stephen King reading journey, in my time in the fandom being a constant reader, I have read most of his earlier work. However, the Bachman books are probably the earliest work of his that I have not yet read, and that was for a lot of reasons, primarily being that the original bind-up of the Bachman books with all 4 stories, including Rage, is not in print anymore. Rage has been pulled from publication. It's not published anymore based on a decision that Stephen King made himself, so it is incredibly hard to find Rage. I was incredibly lucky to find this at a secondhand bookstore so that I have all 4 of the Bachman books in one bind-up. The other 3 are pretty easy to find still, and some of them, especially in terms of movies, are some of like his most well-known work, I feel like, so definitely easy to find most of them, just not the first book in the Bachman books, which is Rage. So my copy here, I have all 4. We have Rage, we have The Long Walk, we have Roadwork, and we have The Running Man. My copy also has an introduction by Stephen King talking about why he was Bachman, why he chose the pen name Richard Bachman to publish these works under, so I'll be reading all of those. I probably won't have an update after the Why I Was Bachman introduction unless there's like a lot to unpack there, but the way that I'm going to kind of set up this vlog, this reading journey of the Bachman books is it is pretty, I feel like if you have 4 books in here, they're all going to be fairly short-ish, at least in terms of a Stephen King book. So my plan for this is to read each book in completion and then kind of give some of my thoughts after I read each one, as well as talk about kind of my list from least favorite to favorite at the end, just as well as anything else that I might have about the books. I'll kind of try and keep them spoiler free. I'm really looking forward to picking these books up. I recently reread On Writing by Stephen King, which is a nonfiction book. It's kind of like part memoir and then part like book on writing, the craft of writing, so kind of a 2-in-1 situation there, but just the passion and just the love for writing. When I was reading that book for Stephen King, I hadn't read a King in quite some time, so I really wanted to dive into a Stephen King book after I finished that one, or rather a fiction book by Stephen King. So I figured I had been putting this one off for a while for a number of reasons, because I feel like, well, Roadwork is the one I've heard the least about, but The Long Walk and The Running Man I feel like are both very iconic. Rage is kind of iconic for a different reason. It's kind of more infamous, especially having to do with the subject matter and how it is no longer in print. So we'll talk about that maybe a little bit as well, but I am going to get started with reading this one. So I'm going to be reading the introduction, Why I Was Bachman, as well as Rage, and Rage follows a school shooting. I am not sure if it follows like the shooting in real time or if it's maybe like a study of the aftermath of such an event, but that's all I know about it. I know that because it is heavily featured on not just a school shooting, but the school shooter himself, that was kind of why King decided to pull it, because he just didn't want that out in the world and maybe influence anybody. So I am going to start with those 2 works, and I will talk to you all once I've completed them. Okay, so it has been a longer period of time than when I started this vlog to now to kind of start talking about this book, because I have finished Rage and it was only 130 pages, so it really didn't take me too long to read it. It definitely took me longer than I thought I would need to read it, and then just also I honestly have no idea when this vlog is going to go up now, because I started this vlog before the Buffalo supermarket shooting and before the Uvalde school shooting, so obviously reading a book about a school shooting from the point of view of the school shooter was just like not something that I wanted to engage in. I was about like halfway through it when these really horrible real world things happened, kind of in tandem with me reading this book. So that took a while. I had to take a break from that because for obvious reasons. And just kind of after I finished it, I wanted to kind of think on really, it's like the worst time and also like a really like interesting time to have read this book and kind of really understand, I feel like, why Stephen King pulled Rage, the short story, off of publication. He stopped printing it, or rather he made the decision to have it not in publication anymore. He didn't print it, but it was a lot. Controversy of the book and it no longer being in publication aside, I just didn't really care for it. Rage as a story is definitely, I think it is one of like the earliest Bachman books that he did write very early on in his career. I do feel like that's very easy to see here. It is about 130 pages, give or take, at least in my version, and you're primarily in one location the whole entire time. There's some flashbacks to our main character's life and what led him to this point of becoming a school shooter and holding his classmates hostage, but mostly you are just in the classroom for the whole entire time. I do generally tend to really enjoy his longer works, so this is not really a criticism I really have of King too often, but I felt like this story was very long. It felt longer than it was. It definitely felt like an early work. I think from what I can remember, this was written, or at least in part, if not the whole thing, was written before Carrie. So obviously I feel like if you picked up Carrie and you picked up like 11, 22, 63, very different writing, obviously, as King has kept writing throughout the years and grown in the craft. So to me, this just like subject matter aside was just not very enjoyable. You're in the point of view of a very unlikable character, which I think is important to point out here. I never got the sense that we were supposed to really empathize with this school shooter. And obviously, I don't know if it's just me reading from the point of view as someone who is in their late 20s and like isn't a teenager, who's never been a teenage boy. He was not likable. I never really got that we were supposed to really root for him at any point or sympathize with him. So I will say there's that. I was a little nervous going in, kind of knowing who our main character was going to be. So I never got that, but it's just very deeply unpleasant to be following someone who is so unpleasant. I definitely didn't expect Rage to be as almost Lord of the Fliesian as it was. I feel like that's definitely like an inspiration for this short story in terms of dynamics. I do think what's interesting though, Lord of the Flies obviously is not like just a critique of kids on an island together. It's very much a critique of the privileged group of young boys who are on that island, and maybe begging the question, if it were another demographic, if it were another group of people, would they react the same way as they did? I feel like that's a big takeaway from the Lord of the Flies. So obviously this is kind of a very different group of people. Again, this is something I think I have pointed out before with King in like The Stand or other things like that. It is very interesting how many things about the human condition, how many things that he gets right. Just in terms of people reacting to horrible things, I don't think he gets it at all right. And here, this was written before Columbine, before so many horrific school shootings in American history. So, you know, there's not really any basis to base this off of as a story. You know, having seen and heard from so many real life survivors, witness accounts, and other things like that, just this really is not a believable story at all. I understand maybe some of what it's trying to do, but it really is, it leaves a gross taste in your mouth kind of reading about the dynamics and how everything goes down, knowing how things go down in real life. I mean, obviously it's fiction and it was written before, you know, this was kind of unfortunately a commonplace thing in the United States. I don't know if I would have felt differently about this if I would have read it when it came out first. Obviously that's impossible for me to have done, but just like in today's climate, and then kind of knowing and having those accounts of young students who have survived horrific things like this and hearing about how things go down, it just doesn't feel very good. It doesn't feel very true to life either, which I feel like Stephen King is normally very good at. However, I do think that's kind of going to be a different theme with the Bachman books. I have read Thinner before by Richard Bachman, and I have kind of noticed that it's very much a more cynical view of life and a more pessimistic view of life almost than King's books. So, you know, maybe if Stephen King would have written Rage as opposed to Richard Bachman, how things played out would have been a little bit different, but it is like a very pessimistic, very uncomfortable view. It was an uncomfortable reading experience, and yeah, I didn't like it. And originally when I was planning on filming this video, I didn't know how much I would talk about like King's decision to have Rage be pulled from publication. I do think I'm going to talk about it a little bit more than I anticipated, just because with current events in the United States, I definitely understand it. I will say this is not the first piece of fiction that I have read having to deal with a school shooting, and I'll also say it's not the piece of fiction that makes you like empathize or kind of portrays the school shooter as a good person. I honestly, there are books that are still being published, still in publication, that I feel kind of make the school shooter more sympathetic, and kind of blurs those lines a little bit. In particular, I'm thinking of 19 Minutes by Jodi Picoult, which was it's not a good book. I don't recommend it, but it is about a school shooting. It follows the school shooter as one of our main characters, and without too much of spoilers for that one, because this is obviously not about that book, but it really has you believe. It makes some very weird choices. One is kind of using Columbine survivors, like their stories and likenesses, and kind of having some of the victims go through the same thing as Columbine victims without acknowledging it once. So that's strange. And then also one of the victims in 19 Minutes of the school shooting, you find out he's done some horrible things, and it's kind of like leads you to believe, well, oh, that's okay that he's one of the victims because he wasn't a good person. And then it's just a much more sympathetic, you're almost supposed to feel for the school shooter as a protagonist and sympathize with him a lot more. So King is not the only writer who has kind of tackled this very difficult topic. Rage, again, I'm speaking from someone who's not like a teen boy, so I couldn't tell you if maybe a teen boy would read this and sympathize and identify with our main character more, but me reading this, I never felt like King's goal was to make you sympathize with the school shooter. So just in terms of that, you know, I don't think that anything in fiction should be off limits for authors to write about. So definitely I think it's something if like publishers themselves or people who would like protest against it, if that was why it was no longer in print, I wouldn't think that that was like acceptable. I work in a library and I'm really big on having media accessible for everyone, not censoring any sort of media, even things that you personally disagree with. So in terms of that, I don't think that this is like the worst piece of fiction about a school shooting to have ever been printed. And while it is not a good reading experience, it's really not like the most gratuitous thing. I will say I've even read like Stephen King books that are more gratuitous almost, for lack of a better word, with the violence and things like that than Rage was. Now moving on to the fact that it was the author's decision, it was Stephen King's decision to call up his publisher and have it be pulled from publication, or call his agent and have it be pulled from publication. I really understand that. I think just on a human level, I think having written something, and I don't know like how true this is because I can't really find any in-depth Stephen King interviews. I mostly see like articles and things like that kind of referencing the decision to remove it from publication. So I don't know how much of this is like lore or has been like built out of proportion, maybe changed a little bit through the telephoning of talking about the subject. I don't know which one, because again, I don't know how like accurate the information was from like my quick Google deep dive, but apparently like Rage was found in like a school shooter's backpack or something like that, or it was talked about being like a favorite book of a school shooter. I'm not entirely sure like what the actual truth of that is, but I could honestly, I really understand being a writer, putting something out into the world, and obviously it's not Stephen King's fault if even if Rage was like the favorite book of a mass shooter, it's not Stephen King's fault that such a tragedy would happen. However, I understand on a very personal level, especially with like what's been happening like this week, and just feeling, just as a person that's completely unconnected to the shootings, and just feeling so helpless and not knowing like what to do, and wanting to help and not knowing what to do. I can totally understand him feeling guilt, I guess. I'm not saying that he should feel guilty, because obviously not a writer's fault for someone deciding to do a terrible thing, but I can totally understand where just feeling guilty for, you know, whatever small part of a horrible event, and, you know, just trying to do whatever you can. So I understand on a personal level why he would want to pull this. Also, I think it's important too, the kind of intention also behind this no longer being in publication, right? Because I was able to find this pretty easily through a secondhand bookstore. Just a quick search of Google, you can find this story. This story is not like a lost book. It's not disappeared. If you as a reader want to read Rage, it's not going to be impossible for you to find a copy of Rage to read. It's going to be pretty easy for you to find a copy, to find this story out there. I think the difference is kind of, as an author, not wanting to profit off of a story that kind of is a part of the culture of gun violence. Again, I don't like, it's hard to articulate these things. Like I understand his thought process, and obviously I'm not saying that it's right, and I'm really not saying that in any way it is his fault or he is responsible for writing the story and having it out there in the world. I do understand feeling uncomfortable with having it out there and continuing to profit off of it. Like if he still had Rage as something you could buy, I understand as an author not wanting to continuously profit from something that was tangentially, however small in a way, kind of connected to real life tragedies. So I definitely an interesting reading experience, definitely not a reading experience that I thought would kind of really hit so close to home. It's definitely, it's hard. And I know it's been like a very hard time for, I feel like, probably all of America. I mean, it's something that is just especially a school shooting when you think about it. My father-in-law and my mother are both teachers, and also I have little siblings that are in school, some of them that were very close in age to the students that were murdered this week. So it was a hard reading experience, and it was not a fun reading experience to be reading about Rage, and then to kind of talk about it. I definitely have not like been wanting to kind of talk about Rage, and it's not really a story that I'll probably ever interact with again. I honestly would probably feel the same way had I not been reading this so close to two very mass shootings, just because I really didn't like it, and just because it's not like a book that it's not like a story that you finish and there's a happily ever after, obviously, and it's a very like pessimistic sort of story. So I mean, regardless, I probably wasn't going to have the best time reading it. I do think though it's very interesting reading Rage, and obviously hindsight's 2020. I know that Richard Bachman, Stephen King, it's Stephen King writing it. He has just such a unique voice as a storyteller. I totally get how people could have figured out that Richard Bachman was Stephen King. So I will say that I'm pretty sure it's going to be my least favorite story in this collection, for a lot of reasons, but I am pretty excited to move on to The Long Walk. I honestly get The Long Walk and The Running Man confused. They kind of occupy the same space in my brain. I've never seen like any movie adaptation. I know like the bare minimum of the stories, and they're kind of, I get confused by them. But The Long Walk is a story about a group of kids who kind of participate in this like walking competition, and they have to walk until the last one is standing, and the last one who's standing does win a substantial monetary prize. However, the last one standing is a very literal term here, because if you stop walking or don't walk fast enough, have to drop out of the race for any reason, you are murdered. So moving on to the long walk, I have to double check with my dad because, again, the long walk, the Running Man, I always get them confused. I believe though it is the long walk that my dad read as a teenager, and he said it's like one of the pieces of fiction that's really stuck with him and like really hit him really hard. So I think it's the long walk, because that one has to deal with teens and younger boys, and the Running Man is about an adult. So if I had to guess, I'm pretty sure he said the long walk. I'll have to double check with him, but I have a feeling that I'm going to enjoy the long walk a whole lot better than Rage. So I am going to read that one, and I will come back, talk about my thoughts when I'm done with the next short story. Alright, so I finished the long walk. Let's talk about it. So first off, I did enjoy this one a whole lot better than I did Rage for so many reasons. I just feel like ultimately, even though this one is like kind of the same depressing, kind of pessimistic tone as Rage had, as I'm going to assume all of the Bachman books do have, I thought that this was just done so much better. And I know I said one of my main critiques of Rage was that it felt like it was so stationary. It was just taking place in one classroom, one specific location for most of the action, and it ultimately made that 130-page novella feel like it was about 300 pages. It felt long. This one is about a group of boys who all set out in a dystopian future of America. They go on this long walk. There's 100 boys. It's a race to pretty much the last boy standing wins, but if you stop walking for any reason, your ticket gets punched, as the boys like to call it, or you get eliminated for real. These boys are murdered off one by one until the last boy is left standing. So really, you would think that I might have kind of this same sort of critique as I did for Rage, in that they are really in the long walk doing one thing, and it's quite a bit longer. I want to say this one, I feel like it's about 200 something pages. I'm not sure. In my bind up, it's just continual page numbers, so I'm going to say I know it's longer than Rage, but it didn't feel long. I think part of it was because it was a competition with very high stakes, but it just was such a good storytelling that it should have felt stale. Like, all these boys were doing was walking for hundreds of pages, but it just felt very fresh. This one, I felt like one of the things that I thought was most impactful about this book was that there are 100 boys that start out in this long walk, and you're introduced to our main character Garrity and a lot of his friends. They pretty much use last names in here, so that's the last name of our main character. You get to know the names of about 10 to 15 boys, but there are 100 boys in this race. So as they're picked off one by one, the first couple of deaths in here especially, I felt as a reader, as a horror reader especially, and I felt like this was kind of intentional with Stephen King. You read about the first boys getting eliminated and it doesn't feel real. They're eliminated, you keep on moving with the story, but as like the numbers thin out and you like start to see more deaths, and as our main characters really understand, because they're all teenage boys, so as they slowly start to realize they all knew what they were signing up for when they signed up for this long walk, and as they keep going and seeing people actually die in front of them and really realize what they have decided to do, what the choices that they made to do the long walk, and what the repercussion is, because only one of them makes it out alive. So just the gradual dawning horror of all of these characters, and they make little friendships along the way because they're days on this long walk together, talking together, forming relationships, while all the while knowing only one of them makes it out alive, and them just really slowly starting to understand like the finality of death. I thought it was so well done. Side note, I did listen to quite a bit of The Long Walk on audiobook while I was on a treadmill. For large portions of this book, I read it as like my gym audiobook. So that was such a wild experience. I would honestly recommend it. That's how I at least finished the end of this book, was on the treadmill today. And definitely like a very strange reading experience, but I thought it really heightened it as I'm walking, listening to this horrific event happening with all of these boys walking. So that was definitely a very interesting and visceral reading experience. I will say I think the ending is one of the better done Stephen King endings, especially for the novellas. I honestly feel like The Long Walk is probably novel length, definitely on the shorter side, definitely on the novella side for Stephen King, who's a very lengthy and wordy writer overall. I felt like it ended well. I definitely also think this is one where at least I knew about it before going into this one. I feel like this is probably the most famous of these Bachman books, and I just feel like it is something that gets referenced a lot, and it's really easy to see how it influenced a lot of other work going forward. So I feel like it's something that's very much in pop culture. I feel like especially if you're a horror reader, maybe you might know like the gist of the plot. Sometimes I feel like when I go into books knowing that and they're just this big thing that everyone has read or everyone knows about the plot, that sometimes I can come away from it feeling like kind of underwhelmed by this grand, great classic or one of the great books that everyone is talking about, that everyone loves reading. But I can honestly say, even though like I knew the synopsis, so there was really not any surprise, I really would have loved to read this when it came out, having that premise kind of be shockingly dropped upon you. But I can say, even though I knew like the basic synopsis of what was going to happen in The Long Walk and kind of what the setup of the story was, I still had a lot of fun enjoying this. Again, I said it in Rage, I'll say it in this one even more. Definitely could see how people would read this book written by Richard Bachman and kind of see that it's Stephen King. I definitely think that there are intentional like narrative choices to kind of differentiate the pen name from the author. I definitely feel like the Bachman books kind of have their own vibe, especially now that I've read three things, The Long Walk, Rage, and Thinner. They definitely feel like their own entity separate from a lot of Stephen King books, but at the same time, just especially with Garrity, our main character, he's this, you know, average Joe from Maine. So it's a lot of things that you see all the time in King's work, like that are staples of King's work, are in The Long Walk. This one is definitely one where you can easily find it on its own. I think it's actually sold pretty much by itself now as its own book, so I would recommend you check it out. I had a lot of fun reading it, and definitely I thought it had some interesting things to say, and it was definitely very horrific. Definitely I think is going to be one that I think about what it was saying for a while after I finished reading it. But that's kind of my initial thoughts on The Long Walk. I don't really have too much to say just in terms of what all went down during it. I feel like it was a mostly positive reading experience for me. I had a good time reading it. I definitely also think that it's going to be very hard. At least I'm trying to go in with my mind not made up, but I think it's going to be pretty hard for Roadwork or The Running Man to top The Long Walk as my favorite Bachman book story, but we'll see. So Roadwork is next. I am going to dive into that, and I will talk to you all when I'm done with it. So I did DNF Roadwork. I don't know if you can tell by like the hair or just based on like recent events that I was talking about in the last clip or so. It's taken me a while to get to this point. This has been a very long video in the making. It wasn't supposed to be that long. I didn't anticipate needing like this much time to kind of read the Bachman books, but a big part of that was because I really wanted to DNF Roadwork, and I felt like if I was making a video about the Bachman books, I couldn't DNF any of them. So I just went back and forth. I started and restarted it, put it down, picked it back up like 5 or 6 times, tried reading it physically, tried listening to the audiobook. I just was not interested. And at the end of the day, I just, you know, that's okay. I think that's more of like a fair review for it than me like pushing myself through it and reading it. And obviously, I don't think I would have liked it very much had I forced myself to read it. So I think that's just going to be the fairest, most comprehensive review that I can give, is that I just was not interested. I did read a good amount of the story most times that I tried to pick it up. And I didn't like read one page and stop it. I don't know what it is. Had I guessed that I was going to DNF one of these, I probably would have guessed that I would have DNF'd Rage, but that one was very readable. And I haven't really felt, I'm trying to think of other Stephen King books that have felt like that before, because I am a big Stephen King fan, and off the top of my head I can't think about anything that I feel like there were maybe a couple of short stories in short story collections where maybe I felt like I didn't really care about what was happening, but they were so short that I could keep reading them. Obviously this one was a lot longer, so you know, I own it, and it is really easy for me to either pick this up and read it or check out the audiobook from my library again, but I do think I'm going to stick with the DNF for right now, because I think I started this video in March and I was anticipating getting this done around March. I just was so conflicted between whether or not to push through and finish Roadwork or just DNF it. I've decided to DNF it because I just keep putting this video off because I just had a roadblock when it comes to Roadwork. So I am going to move on to The Running Man. If you really love Roadwork, let me know in the comments down below, like sell it to me. I've tried because I think I've read synopsises of it and I think it'll be interesting, and I like Stephen King as an author. I don't know, just was not in the mood and haven't been in the mood for months now. So I'm DNFing. I'm moving on to The Running Man. I'm hoping that I'm going to like The Running Man more, but either way, I'm hoping to at least finish The Running Man, and then I will talk to you all with my thoughts on The Running Man and then my thoughts about the Bachman books as a whole. So I finally finished The Running Man, which means I finally finished the Bachman books by Stephen King, and it has been a journey. It has definitely been a longer journey than I anticipated. Definitely have like different feelings about some of the books in here than I anticipated. Quick little recap of The Running Man though. It's the year 2025, which I think is very interesting because obviously futuristic sci-fi now is coming up to like present day. It's the year 2025. The US is in quite the dystopian future, and the economic situation for most Americans is so bad that there are incentivized game shows that are televised where contestants literally play and sometimes play with their lives in order to receive money to get necessary life-saving services, or just get enough money to get by, get food, get water, medical services. So we follow our main character, Ben Richards, as he and his wife are very out on their luck. They have a young daughter who is very, very sick with pneumonia and she needs medicine. They cannot afford it, so he applies to be in these television shows. He gets on The Running Man, which is a show where he is the running man and he runs away from people where they are essentially hunting him down. The longer he stays alive, the more money his family receives. So The Running Man was definitely not my least favorite, not my most favorite in the collection. I did think it was very interesting that 2 of the 4 novels in this collection really dealt with very similar gamified sort of life or death situations where contestants are competing for basic life necessities in like a dystopian future. This was published far before, I believe, reality TV, at least reality TV like we know it today, ever existed. So kind of seeing that be prophesized, I guess. Obviously not altogether prophesized, because of course we don't actually kill people on reality TV for entertainment, but I definitely think there are things to be seen there about the way that we do kind of really monetize quite a lot that for other people's entertainment. That's definitely an aspect or something that is critiqued in horror even today. If you see Nope by Jordan Peele, that very recently came out, so it's definitely interesting to see kind of the same themes and see in horror kind of the same societal themes and issues kind of get brought up and talked about through the lens of horror, which I just think is an absolutely wonderful thing that horror as a genre does. Now, I do think I might have liked this more had it not been in this collection, because I think very similarly themed to The Long Walk. In the end, very different books, very different premises, but also very similar in terms of what is kind of happening at the very main core of the story almost. And I think I liked The Long Walk. I think it did it quite a bit better than The Running Man, but I did still really enjoy it. Definitely still has that Richard Bachman very much negative ending. Definitely they tend to be more pessimistic books, I think, than Stephen King books as a whole. It was definitely harder to get through than The Long Walk. Generally, like, I don't tend to like, I'm not a big fan of like the white supremacy movies or like that plot where someone is on the run from an entity, from the government or whatever. I don't tend to like those on the run sort of movies or just like plot in general. So definitely for me, the premise by itself, not something I normally gravitate towards. I did think it was also frustrating to read from and simultaneously interesting that I really don't think that Ben Richards is that likable of a main character. I don't know if he's supposed to be that likable or not. Definitely, I feel like maybe it's one of those things where as a modern reader, you take away different things than a reader that would read it when it first came out. But for me, I just think he's a very unlikable person, but I almost think that works really well with kind of some of the points that King is trying to convey. Obviously, the society that Ben Richards lives in is horrible. It's very much like not sustainable for anyone but the top members of the population. So, you know, even though he's not a great person, not a likable person, obviously he should still be able to like make a living and get by without completely selling his actual life to a game for other people to enjoy, just so his family can receive like life-saving healthcare. So yeah, I really did not like him as a main character. It's very hard to be, it's a very solitary book for most of it, as you can imagine, just based on the one man running from something storyline that it is following. So that was hard, but I think it might be part of like what King is trying to convey. I just don't think he's the most likable person, but at the end of the day, doesn't matter if he's likable. No. So I'm finally done with this very infamous collection. Definitely, I thought a very mixed bag. So coming in at the bottom, I have to put this story at the bottom, would be Roadwork. I just could not get through it. Maybe one day, but I couldn't get through it. Then coming in next, I'm gonna have to say Rage. Looking at it completely separately from the controversial subject matter, this was one of the very first things that Stephen King wrote, and I do feel like it shows. It's not the best writing, and it's just like a story in a very solitary location, which can be hard for very engaging storytelling, and it's something that I think that King does very well later on. Just in this story, it just did not feel like the best piece of writing that I've ever read by this author. I know he can do so much better. He's one of my favorite authors. So yeah, and I also just didn't really feel like there was a point. Not that everything has to have a point, but when I was reading it, it just wasn't a very enjoyable story. You're not in the mind of an enjoyable character. I don't think it's condoning the actions of the main character whatsoever. Just, it's not a fun place to be in. It's not a fun place, a headspace to be in and follow this awful character, just kind of following like these very awful series of events. Coming up next, we have The Running Man. Like I kind of touched on earlier, I do think I would have enjoyed it, appreciated it maybe a little bit more had it been in a different collection, because thematically, I just think it's very, very similar to my favorite story in this collection, and I think that my favorite story did it quite a bit better, and that would be The Long Walk. I think the story is so much better than the rest of the books in this collection. I do think it's one where you can find it by itself, whether on audio, or I think they even sell it like in a physical book just by itself. I think it's by far the standout of this collection. I think it has characters that stay with you. You really feel like you're in the event with the characters and just the slow, gradual horror as you, alongside the characters, really understand what's happening and really feel the finality of what's happening. I really think it's wonderful writing and it's truly horrific. So there you have it. I finally read, I think this was probably the most intimidating book on my Stephen King TBR. I've read a lot of the more intimidating ones by this point. It was a very intimidating book on my TBR. I'm very glad I read it, especially because The Long Walk and The Running Man, I feel like, are both very popular, not only books, but I think they both have movie adaptations as well. I feel like a lot of people know about them, so I am glad that I read it. Definitely a mixed bag, but I had a good time for the most part. But that is going to be it, the end of this deep dive on the Bachman books. If you have another Stephen King book you'd like to see me read and kind of dissect in a similar matter, or any other kind of Stephen King content, definitely let me know down below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel for more content from me. Stay safe, stay spooky, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye!